Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 123rd deck and it's titled Toss a Token to Your Hellion. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was actually suggested to us by Adidas 4DFWD over on Reddit, and that card is going to be Thromok the Insatiable. So Thromok the Insatiable is 3 red, green for a 0/0 legendary creature, Hellion, with Devour X, where X is the number of creatures devoured this way. Now, a couple of quick things that we got to talk about before we get into the actual deck tech. Number one, as you may know, there is an unspoken rule on the channel that if we have a legendary creature as our random card, it does have to be our commander, because otherwise, how else could we really build around it? So Thromok is our commander this week. And I think it's important that we talk a little bit about how Devour is going to work, because there are sometimes some confusions over that. So in this case, Thromok has Devour X, where X is the number of creatures devoured this way. So if Thromok devours one creature, in other words, we sacrifice one creature when it enters the battlefield, then he enters with 1+1/+1 counter. If we sacrifice 2 creatures, we've devoured 2 of them, then he enters with 2 counters for each creature sacrificed, so he actually enters with 4. If we sacrifice 3, it's 3 for each one, so he enters with 9. You can kind of see where this is going. But our main goal with Thromok is to get him either to 21 power, so he can knock people out with commander damage, or get him all the way up to 40 plus power. And as long as we want him to have more than 40 power, the fewest creatures we're going to have to sacrifice is going to be 7. If we sacrifice 7 creatures, he comes in with 49 +1/+1 counters and is then able to knock out any player from their starting life total. So that is technically our little secret goal of the deck. It's not going to be the thing that we're focusing toward the entire time, but that is kind of our underlying strategy. And so because of that, we're going to have a couple of themes that play into what we're actually trying to do. The first of those themes is, of course, tokens. We need to make sure that we have things to devour when Thromok comes into play, and we don't really want to sacrifice cards that are actually going to be benefiting us in some way, not cards that we can't really get out of the graveyard or cards that may be big creatures on their own. So our big way of doing this is going to be tokens. And a good example of that is Sprout Swarm, which is 1 and a green for an instant. It has Convoke, Buyback for 3, and what it does is just puts a 1/1 green sapling creature token into play. So essentially for 5 mana, we get to make a 1/1 and return the spell to our hand. That doesn't seem very efficient, but if we get a ton of tokens, we can actually convoke it out, buy it back, recast it, and keep going, and we can do that as many times as we have the tokens. So essentially 5 tokens in play means that we can just make a free 1/1 sapling at the end of someone's turn. So if we have 10, we get 2 for free. If we have 15, we get 3, and we can slowly spiral out of control with Sprout Swarm in play. Now, this isn't the only way we're going to be getting tokens. There's plenty of other ways, but we can't win the game on tokens alone. And that is where our second theme is going to come in, because we need to focus on devouring. Yes, our commander has Devour, but that's not going to be the only thing with Devour in our entire deck, because otherwise we might be making all these tokens for no real reason. So we are playing pretty much every Devour creature that we can in order to make the tokens work if for some reason we can't cast Thromok. So a good example of this is Mycoloth, which is 3 green for a 4/4 fungus. It has Devour 2. So again, a reminder on Devour, this one just comes in with 2 counters for each thing sacrificed. It doesn't scale in the same way that Thromok does, so if we sacrifice 5, we'll still only get 10. But at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 green sapling creature token for each +1/+1 counter on Mycoloth. And this can be very, very important for the deck, because if Mycoloth comes in and devours just a single creature and gets 2 +1/+1 counters, then at the start of our next turn, we get 2 creatures to replace the one that we sacrificed. And so then we're using Mycoloth to generate a bunch more creatures, which also then plays into the fact that we can use those to sacrifice for our other Devour creatures, essentially giving us a board full of tiny creatures, but also a board full of giant creatures that have devoured our other creatures. And then you might be wondering, now that we have all these tokens, now that we have all this Devour, what do we actually wind up doing? And so that leads us to our third theme, which is going to be our +1/+1 counters. Because devouring creatures puts +1/+1 counters on our creatures, we need to find ways to make that work to our benefit. And so that's where cards like Uncivil Unrest comes in, which is 4 and a red for an enchantment that says non-token creatures you control have Riot, which is very important. It helps give haste to some of our big creatures that we may not have otherwise. But even more importantly, if a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage instead. That is incredibly relevant when we're talking about how big some of our creatures could be. Mycoloth on its own is just a 4/4, but if it devours a single creature, it becomes a 6/6 and has 2 +1/+1 counters on it, meaning it's now dealing 12 damage with Uncivil Unrest. And that's just if it devours one creature. Imagine how much damage it could do if it devoured, say, 15. So Uncivil Unrest is a great way to help close out the game and give us a reason to be putting all these counters on our creatures. But those are our themes for this week. We do still have to talk a little bit about some of our key cards. These are the cards that synergize very well with what we're doing, and in some cases will help push us toward a victory, or in others might just be great value engines. So the first of the cards that we're going to have to talk about is Dragon Broodmother. This is arguably one of the best Devour creatures in the entire deck, if not the entire game, because it is 2 red, 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 green for a 4/4 dragon with flying. At the beginning of each upkeep, put a 1/1 red and green dragon creature token with flying and Devour 2 into play. So Dragon Broodmother herself does not have Devour, but we are now making a 1/1 creature with Devour 2 every single upkeep. And notice it is not the beginning of your upkeep, it is each upkeep. So even if they're not devouring anything, by the time it gets back around to our turn, we've made one for each of our opponents plus ourselves. We now have 4 1/1s that we didn't have before, and we can also use them to build on each other. So for example, if we make 3 1/1s on each of our opponent's turn, and then we have the one that comes in on our turn, we can have it actually devour the other 3, meaning it's coming in with 6 +1/+1 counters, so now we just have a 7/7 flyer kind of out of nowhere, because we haven't done anything extra to get to that point. And maybe that's not exactly what we're trying to do. We just devour maybe some saprolings or some goblin tokens, whatever we have laying around, and we can just build an army of giant flying dragons very, very quickly. So Dragon Broodmother is really an all-star in this deck and is a great way to keep the Devour train going if that's something we seem to be running short on. Our next key card, though, is going to be Chandra's Ignition. So again, we're caring about making these huge creatures, so we want ways to actually win the game or benefit us for making those huge creatures. So Chandra's Ignition is 3 red red for a sorcery that says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. So if we go back to Thromok really quickly, if Thromok devours 7 creatures and he has 49 power, we cast Chandra's Ignition and do 49 damage to each opponent and each creature our opponents control. Unless our opponents have gained life, that just ends the game right there. And there's a good chance that we can do that for less mana or for less devouring, I suppose I should say, because our opponents may have lost life throughout the course of the game, but it's a great way to just win the game on the spot. And if we were to pull that off, even in one turn, casting Thromok is 5 mana, Chandra's Ignition is 5 mana, so we just need 10 mana to be able to pull off a combo that could just win the game. And since we're in the Gruul colors, we do have a significant amount of ramp, we could easily pull that off. So that is a unique way to win the game, but we also still have our last key card, which is Clown Car. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I kind of put this in here just because I like this card, but it is a surprisingly efficient card because it does everything we want to do in this deck. So Clown Car is X mana for a 1/1 vehicle. When Clown Car enters the battlefield, roll X 6-sided dice. For each odd result, you make a 1/1 clown robot artifact creature token. For each even result, put a +1/+1 counter on Clown Car, then it crews for 2. And of course, you can't forget it does run on Laughing Gas, so we are going to make good use of Clown Car in this deck. Because if we get the tokens, that's great. We can sacrifice them to Devour. And if we get the +1/+1 counters, that's great because we have synergies that care about our +1/+1 counters. So as weird as it is to have this deck full of giant Hellions and dragons and saprolings and goblins to just start running out a clown car, it still kind of works. It might be a bit of a flavor fail, but it's definitely very powerful because we can just sink all of our mana into it and do everything that we want to be doing. So those are our 3 key cards of the week. And the next thing we got to do is take a look at some cool interactions. And these are cards that either synergize very well together, work toward a combo together, or maybe are just cards that I want to highlight because I think they work in kind of unique and cool situations. So the first cool interaction I want to talk about is Ravenous Gigantotherium and Fling. Now, notably, we could replace Ravenous Gigantotherium here with any other creature with Devour, but it has Devour 3, which is one of the highest Devours in the entire deck, so I figured we'd focus on that. So Ravenous Gigantotherium is 5 green for a 3/3 beast. It has Devour 3. When Ravenous Gigantotherium enters the battlefield, it deals X damage divided as you choose among up to X target creatures, where X is its power. Then each of those creatures deals damage equal to its power to Ravenous Gigantotherium. So it's not technically fighting the creatures when it comes in, but it is dividing its damage among anything in the battlefield. So if we have, say, 3 creatures that we've devoured, so we devour 3 times, we put 9 +1/+1 counters on Gigantotherium, it has 12 power. We can now divide that 12 power among any number of creatures. And one of the nice things that we can do with it is divide it just so the Gigantotherium lives. So maybe our opponents have 11 1/1 creatures. We have 12 power, we do 1 damage to each of them, we still get to keep our Gigantotherium, we wipe their board, and then we cast Fling. And Fling is 1 and a red for an instant. As an additional cost to cast Fling, sacrifice a creature. Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target creature or player. Then we sacrifice our Gigantotherium. We do 12 damage to any target, most likely our opponent's faces, but we could use it to get rid of a pesky creature on board. So this is a great way to clear away our opponent's boards while still doing a ton of damage to their faces. And if we can even use Fling for a Gigantotherium that got incredibly large, we could again use it to just kind of knock an opponent out of the game. So Gigantotherium and Fling, very powerful on their own in the deck, but I think together they can also be very, very strong. That, though, leads us to our next cool interaction, which is between Conclave Sledge Captain and Dusk Shell Crawler. And this one's going to be a little bit weird, and I'm going to apologize in advance because it does involve math. I am not a math teacher. I teach social studies, so this is not my forte. So, Conclave Sledge Captain is 5 and a green for a 4/4 elephant creature. It has backup 1, backup 1, backup 1, and no, I'm not making a mistake, that is 3 separate triggers. It also has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. And then we have Dusk Shell Crawler, which is 1 and a green for a 0/3 insect. When Dusk Shell Crawler enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample. So before we start talking about the Sledge Captain, I do want to highlight Dusk Shell Crawler in particular. It is incredibly important that we have trample in this deck because almost every Devour creature doesn't have trample. It's kind of playing it safe. You don't want to be able to get a giant creature that then just knocks somebody out of the game. So we need to be able to give them trample. And Dusk Shell Crawler, giving trample to each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, means we can cast, say, Thromok, who has 49 power but no trample, and then just smack someone for 49 power. They can try to block it as much as possible, but there's a good chance that's still enough to kill them. So Dusk Shell Crawler is phenomenal on its own, but if we partner it up with Conclave Sledge Captain, it gets even weirder. So first off, Dusk Shell Crawler, say it's the only creature we have in play. It comes in, it puts a +1/+1 counter on itself, so it's now a 1/4. Conclave Sledge Captain comes in and it backs up 1 3 times. If we put all 3 of those triggers on Dusk Shell Crawler, that means it goes from 1 power to 2 to 3 to 4. So now we have a 4/7 Dusk Shell Crawler with trample. and if it deals combat damage to a player, we actually trigger backup 3 separate times. So if we hit someone for 4, we put 4 counters on it 3 separate times. That's 12 total counters, and now all of a sudden our Duskshell Crawler is a 16-19 with nothing else on board but these 2 cards. And that is incredibly powerful, because that's just talking about the bare minimum. That's talking about a 1 power creature that then became a 16 power creature. We could do the exact same thing for a creature with 5 power, 6 power, 15 power, and if we're doing 15, then we put 15 times 3 on it. It gets 45 counters. It becomes, a 60 power creature. This can get out of hand very, very quickly. So it's incredibly important that if we have Conclave Sledge Captain and we have a board with maybe just Thromok on it, we can actually use the Sledge Captain to give it trample because of backup, and then smack someone kind of out of nowhere with a massive creature that then gets even bigger. Then we can use things like Fling, and we can use Uncivil Unrest, and it just gets really crazy really, really quickly. So I wanted to highlight these 2 cards because they're very powerful together. Even with nothing else in the deck, just these 2 can do a ton of damage. So I think they're very worth the include. I have really never played with either of them, so I think that they're pretty decent in this deck, but let me know what you think. If there's another way you can make this work, I'd be interested to hear your opinions on Conclave Sledge Captain, because I've never actually seen it in a game. But that is enough me rambling about this Elephant Soldier and Insect combo. So the next thing we've got to do is take a look at the budget of the deck. And this week, our budget came in at $88.28 out of a total of $100. So not too bad, but not super cheap either. And the vast majority of our budget actually came from All Will Be One. So All Will Be One, a pretty recent card. It is 3 red for an enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. Now, the reason that this is in here is because we can cast Thromok for, say, 49 +1/+1 counters, and then we don't even have to attack, we don't have to fling it, we don't have to Chandra's Ignition, none of that, because All Will Be One sees us put 49 +1/+1 counters on Thromok and immediately does 49 damage to any target on the board. Well, any target except for battles, of course. So if we do 49 damage to, say, another player, knock them out of the game, then we attack with Thromok, knock another player out of the game, then we fling Thromok, knock the 3rd player out of the game, we can win very, very quickly, very, very efficiently, just from having All Will Be One in play. Now, unfortunately, because it is such a powerful card, and it is actually the key for a lot of infinite combos as well, it is a massive $11.76. So if you did need to cut it for budget purposes, you could trim the deck price down to about $77, which is still not super budget, but it's more manageable than $88. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to increase the price of this deck, I do have a suggestion for some cards that would work for an out-of-budget upgrade. And the main card that I'm going to suggest this week is going to be Terror of the Peaks. So Terror of the Peaks is 3 red for a 5/4 dragon. It's got flying. Spells your opponent's cast that target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So we've already talked about how much power we're going to be putting into play at any given time. So Terror of the Peaks, being able to take the 49 from Thromok, or say even just like a 20 from something else, and just throw it at our opponent's faces, is going to be incredibly powerful and is really going to push the deck a little bit further in terms of what it can accomplish, because now, again, we don't need haste, we don't need trample, we don't need flings, we can just cast our creatures and straight up win the game that way. Now, because you're putting a card into the deck, you would have to take a card out, and I think the card I would suggest is Goblin Instigator, which is 1 in a red for a 1/1 Goblin Rogue. When Goblin Instigator enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 red Goblin creature token. That's not a bad card by any means, and it does put in work in the deck. Giving us 2 goblins to sacrifice is great, but if I'm being perfectly honest, 2 tokens for 2 mana is a little bit under the curve of what we can do in this deck, so it's usually underperforming. We don't really have a ton of goblin synergies. We do have a Krenko mob boss in here that cares about goblins, but that's about it. so I don't think Goblin Instigator does quite enough in the deck to warrant its place if you're able to swap it out for Terror of the Peaks. But those are all of our out-of-budget upgrades for this week, and the next thing we got to do before we jump into the game, of course, is talk a little bit about some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, you can find us over on Twitter, you can find us on Reddit, send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you ever have any questions, I am more than happy to respond on any of these platforms. I'll take suggestions for cards that you have. If you have suggestions and you don't want to head on over to those places, you can always put them in the comments. I will do my best to get to almost all of the suggestions, but I can't promise to get to all of the suggestions unless, of course, you are one of our patrons over at patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there, you can join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Huey, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Devin Purser, and Tyler Esme. So to the 9 of you all, thank you so much for all of your support. And if you would like to join them, you can, of course, head on over to Patreon, or you can join our channel as a channel member. Either of those things will get you access to the deck lists a week early. You'll get access to the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players talking and having a good time rather than just my narration over a shortened version of it. You'll get a random card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. You'll get, like I said earlier, the guarantee that any of your cards suggested will be turned into decks for the channel eventually, and you'll also get access to the Discord channel where we actually brew up a lot of these decks and where we record all of the games that show up on this channel. So if you're interested in being in any of those games, you can certainly reach out to me on Patreon or as a channel member, and I will add you to that Discord, and then you'll be able to play some of the games for the channel. But if none of that is your style, maybe it's just not the time for you, I understand completely. You can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out just as much. So without any further ado though, let's get into one of the most entertaining parts of this deck tech, and that is going to be the game. So now that we've talked a lot about this deck, we know what it can do, we know what we want to be doing, we're going to see how it performs in a game against 3 opponents. And this week we are joined by Shawn playing Neith of the Dire Hunt, Bilal playing Veyron, Voice of Duality, and Cow playing Kadena, Sinking Sorcerer. So starting off with Shawn's Neith deck, this is kind of what it looks like. This is a fight deck. He wants to play a ton of big creatures and have them fight down his opponent's creatures. I'm hoping our creatures are going to be bigger than his, so we may be able to last a little bit longer. He may not want to fight our stuff. He might be forced to fight some of his opponent's things. So hopefully we can outlast Neith. I'm not super concerned, but I wouldn't be surprised if Shawn had some tricks up his sleeve as well. Next up, Bilal's Veyron deck. This is, from what he's mentioned, it used to be a Grixis deck, and he kind of parsed it down to just being Izzet, but it focuses a lot on tokens and things that make tokens when you cast spells, so like young Pyromancer effects. I could see this being a bit of a problem for us if we don't have access to things like Trample, but if we have Trample, I can't imagine a ton of tokens are going to stop us too much, so I'm not super concerned about this one, but similar to Shawn, I wouldn't be surprised if Bilal has a couple of tricks up his sleeve. And then last but not least, we have Cow playing Kadena, and this is, for all intents and purposes, a morph deck. He wants to play as many morphs as possible, manifests as possible, just have some face-down creatures entering under his control to draw a bunch of cards, and then probably some effects that trigger when they flip face up. So that way he's got a bit of a surprise factor. He's got the creatures, but his opponents don't know what they are. I think out of all of these, this is probably the one that I'm the most concerned about. I know that Kadena can be incredibly powerful with the amount of value that it can accrue, and I know that there's a ton of face-down creatures that can mess with what we are trying to do, and just the ability to have the creatures in play but only use them when you need them is a very powerful strategy. So I am worried about Kadena, but if you think I should be more concerned about a different commander, please do let me know. I would love to hear what you think down in the comments, and like I said earlier, please do like and subscribe. But let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Shawn goes first, followed by Bilal, Cow, and then myself. On Shawn's first turn, he plays a forest. Bilal plays an island. Cow plays an opulent palace. I play a myriad landscape. Shawn plays a forest, then casts Rampant Growth, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Bilal plays a mountain, then casts Smoldering Egg, putting a counter on it equal to the mana value of any instant or sorcery he casts, then transforming it if there are 7 or more counters on it. Cow plays a command tower and casts Secret Plans, giving his face down creatures +0/+1 and drawing a card whenever they're turned face up. I play a Care Keep. Shawn casts Ranging Raptors, letting him search his library for a basic land and put it into play tapped whenever it's dealt damage. Bilal plays a Mountain, then casts his commander Veyran Voice of Duality, giving it +1/+1 whenever he casts an instant or sorcery, and doubling any ability that triggers when he casts an instant or sorcery. Cow plays an Island and casts Scroll of Fate, letting him manifest a card from his hand. I play a Forest and cast Kodama's Reach, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into my hand. Unfortunately, I make a mistake and accidentally put them both into play. Shawn casts Arcane Signet, then casts Pounce, having Ranging Raptors fight Veyran, killing Bilal's commander and letting Shawn search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Bilal plays an Island. Cow plays an Island, then casts his commander Kadena Slinking Sorcerer, making his face-down creatures cost 3 less to cast, and also draws him a card when a face-down creature enters the battlefield under his control, and this lets him cast a Morph for free and draw a card. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Krenko Mob Boss, which can tap to create X 1/1 goblin tokens, where X is the number of goblins I control. Shawn casts Harmonize, drawing 3 cards, then plays a Mountain and casts Okame Adversary for 2 less since Cow controls a green creature. Then at the end of turn, Bilal casts Memory Deluge, looking at the top 4 cards of his library, putting 2 into his hand and putting 4 counters on his egg. On Bilal's turn, he plays an Island, then casts Soul Ring, and also casts Goldspan Dragon, making a treasure token when it attacks and letting him sacrifice his treasures for 2 mana. Since it also has haste, he attacks Shawn for 4, making a treasure. Then at the end of turn, Cow activates Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card and drawing a card. On Cow's turn, he plays a Forest, then casts Trail of Mystery, letting him search his library for a basic land and put it into his hand whenever a face-down creature enters under his control, also giving a creature +2/+2 until the end of turn when it's turned face up. He then casts a Morph for free with Kadena, drawing a card and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Legion War Boss, which creates a 1/1 goblin token with haste that has to attack this turn when I move to combat. Once I've moved to combat and made the goblin token, I attack Bilal for 1 and he blocks with his egg, not killing either creature. Shawn plays a Mountain, then, to save some time shuffling, I sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Shawn then casts his commander Neith of the Dire Hunt, letting him draw a card whenever a creature fights or is blocked, and also letting him pay 3 when he goes to combat to double a creature's power and force it to be blocked if able. After that, he casts Domri Anarch of Bolas, giving his creatures +1/+0, and then activates his -2 ability to have Okame Adversary fight the Smoldering Egg, killing it and drawing Shawn a card. He then attacks Bilal for 3 with the Adversary, drawing another card, and attacks me for 3 with the Raptors. Bilal plays a Mountain, then casts Howling Mine, letting each player draw an additional card at the start of their turn. He moves to combat and attacks Domri for 4 with Goldspan, killing the Planeswalker and making a treasure. Then at the end of turn, Cow activates Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card, drawing a card, and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. Still at the end of turn, he unmorphs Vesuvan Shapeshifter, turning it into a copy of Goldspan Dragon and drawing a card. When Cow draws for his turn, he draws an additional card thanks to the Howling Mine. Then he plays a Swamp and casts Soul Ring. Once that's resolved, he activates Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card, drawing a card, and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 4 with a copy of the Goldspan Dragon, making a treasure. In his second main phase, he cast Vraska the Unseen, activating her -3 ability to destroy the real Goldspan Dragon. In response, Bilal flashes back Memory Deluge, looking at the top 7 cards of his library, putting 2 into his hand and the rest on the bottom, but unfortunately he doesn't find a response, so the dragon is destroyed. Then, at the end of Cow's turn, I activate Krenko to create 3 1/1 goblin tokens since I control 3 goblins. In my draw step, I draw an additional card. Then on my turn, I cast All Will Be 1, letting me do damage to any target equal to the number of counters put on my permanents. Once that's resolved, I cast Pride Malkin, giving all my creatures with +1/+1 counters trample, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on Krenko, doing 1 damage to Cow with All Will Be 1. Then I move to combat, making another goblin token and attacking Bilal with the token and the war boss, mentoring the token so it gets a +1/+1 counter, doing another damage to Cow, then Bilal takes 4. On Shawn's turn, he draws an additional card, plays a forest, and then casts Season of Growth, letting him scry 1 when a creature enters under his control, and letting him draw a card when he targets one of his creatures with a spell. After that, he casts Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma, scrying 1, making all his creatures with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and also giving his creatures with 4 or greater power +1/+1 and trample whenever Goreclaw attacks. After that resolves, he casts Prey Upon, having his raptors fight my war boss, killing the goblin, drawing Shawn 2 cards, and letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 2 with the Okame Adversary, drawing another card. At the start of Bilal's turn, he draws an additional card, then casts Ovika Enigma Goliath, making X 1/1 goblin tokens with haste whenever he casts a non-creature spell, where X is the mana value of that spell. When Cow draws for turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a Darkwater Catacombs and activates Scroll of Fate, manifesting a card, drawing a card, and searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand. He then activates Vraska's +1 ability, destroying any creature that deals damage to her. After that, he casts a Feto Runecaster, drawing a card whenever a creature is turned face up. He moves to combat and attacks me for 4 with Goldspan, making a treasure. Then, at the end of turn, I activate Krenko to make 6 more goblin tokens. At the start of my turn, I draw an additional card, then cast my commander Thromok the Insatiable, tapping Krenko in response to create 12 goblin tokens, then having Thromok devour 11 of the goblins when it enters. This has Thromok enter with 11 +1/+1 counters for each goblin devoured, coming in with 121 +1/+1 counters. Unfortunately, Cow has a response, megamorphing Inox Survivalist, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, drawing 2 cards, and, most importantly, destroying All Will Be 1, so I don't get to immediately do 121 damage to someone. Once my commander resolves, I cast Goro, Disciple of Ryusei, paying a mana to activate his ability, giving all my creatures haste. This allows me to attack Cow with Thromok, and even though he throws all of his blockers in front of it, it still tramples over, knocking Cow out of the game. At the start of Shawn's turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a forest and casts Kogla the Titan Ape, fighting Pride Malkin when it enters, killing it, letting Shawn scry 1 and drawing him a card. Then he casts Arnie Slays the Troll, having his Okame Adversary fight my Thromok, killing both creatures and drawing Shawn another card. After that, he casts Fierce Empath, searching his library for a creature with mana value 6 or greater, in this case Apex Altasaur, putting it into his hand. Finally, he moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with Ranging Raptors. When Bilal draws for his turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a mountain and casts Invasion of Karsus, giving it to me to defend, doing 3 damage to each creature, wiping away everything except Krenko, Kogla, and Ovika. This also triggers Shawn's Raptors, letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Bilal then attacks the invasion, transforming it into Refraction Elemental and doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever he casts a spell. When I draw for my turn, I draw an additional card, then I cast Uncivil Unrest, giving my non-token creatures Riot and doubling the damage from any of my creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. I also cast Tuskguard Captain, entering with a +1/+1 counter, and giving my creatures with +1/+1 counters trample. When Shawn draws for turn, he draws an additional card, then his Saga triggers, giving him 2 red mana and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Kogla. He then plays a mountain and also casts Gruul Rage Beast, letting it and any other creature that enters under Shawn's control fight another creature. This time, the Rage Beast fights Refraction Elemental, paying the ward, killing it. Then Shawn also scries 1. After that, he casts Ghalta Primal Hunger, scrying 1 and fighting my Tuskguard Captain, killing it as well. He moves to combat and attacks me for 8 with Kogla, destroying the Uncivil Unrest when it attacks. At the start of Bilal's turn, he draws an additional card, then plays an island and casts Primal Amulet, making his instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, and also creating 4 goblin tokens. After that, he casts Goblin Bombardment, creating 2 more goblins and letting him sacrifice a creature to do 1 damage to any target. He moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 6 with Ovika, and at the end of turn, I activate Krenko to make a single goblin token. When I draw for my turn, I draw an additional card, then I activate Krenko again, making 2 more goblin tokens. This lets me cast Ravenous Gigantotherium, devouring 3 goblin tokens when it enters, so that it enters with 9 +1/+1 counters, and then does 12 damage to Kogla, killing it. Once that's resolved, Bilal sacrifices his 6 goblins to do 6 damage to Shawn's Rage Beast, killing that as well. When Shawn draws for turn, he draws an additional card, then his Saga finishes, gaining him 12 life since he controls a creature with 12 power. After that, he casts Rhythm of the Wild, giving his non-token creatures Riot and preventing his creatures from being countered. He also casts Acidic Slime, scrying 1, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, and destroying Goblin Bombardment. Then he casts Prize Fight, having Acidic Slime fight my Gigantotherium, but I respond by casting Silk Guard, giving my modified creatures hexproof until the end of turn, fizzling Shawn's spell, but he does still draw from Season of Growth. Shawn then plays a mountain and casts Ulvenwald Tracker, entering with a +1/+1 counter and scrying 1. At the start of Bilal's turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a mountain and casts the Locust God, creating a 1/1 insect token with flying and haste whenever he draws a card. He also casts Skull Clamp, creating a goblin token and immediately equipping the Skull Clamp to it, giving it +1/-1, killing it, drawing 2 cards and making 2 insects. He then moves to combat and attacks Shawn for 8 with Ovika and the insects. At the start of my turn, I draw an additional card, then cast Rishkar's Expertise, drawing 12 cards since I control a creature with 12 power, and also casting a card with mana value 5 or less from my hand for free, casting Garruk Primal Hunter. Then I immediately activate Garruk's -3 ability, killing the Planeswalker, to draw 12 more cards since I still control a creature with 12 power. After that resolves, I play a Kessig Wolf Run and cast Harrow, sacrificing a land to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play. When Shawn draws for turn, he draws an additional card, then casts Beast Whisperer, entering with a +1/+1 counter, letting him scry 1, and also letting him draw a card whenever he casts a creature spell. After that, he casts Tyrannex Rex, drawing a card, scrying 1, then entering with a +1/+1 counter. He activates Ulvenwald Tracker, having Acidic Slime fight the Locust God, killing both creatures. He then moves to combat and attacks Bilal with Ghalta and the Tyrannax for 21 damage. Before damage though, Bilal casts Illusionist's Gambit, making 4 goblins, and removing all attacking creatures from combat, giving Shawn an extra combat step, and forcing those creatures to attack a different player during the next combat step. Because of this, Shawn is forced to switch his attacks and attack me for 21 total damage instead. I block the Tyrannax with my Gigantotherium, killing Shawn's dinosaur and only taking 12 damage. Then, at the end of turn, Locust God returns to Bilal's hand. At the start of Bilal's turn, he draws an additional card, then equips Skull Clamp to a goblin, killing it and drawing 2 more. plays a mountain, and recasts the Locust God before equipping Skull Clamp to 2 more goblins, killing them, drawing 4 cards, and making 4 insects. He also casts Young Pyromancer, making a 1/1 elemental token whenever he casts an instant or sorcery. Once that's resolved, he moves to combat and attacks Shawn and I both for 6 with his flyers. At the end of turn, I activate Krenko to once again make a single goblin token. When I draw for my turn, I draw an additional card, then I play a Cinderglade and cast Fungal Sprouting, making 12 Saproling tokens since I control a creature with 12 power. I also activate Krenko, making 2 more goblin tokens, then I cast Prey Caesar Dragon, devouring all 12 Saprolings so that it enters with 24 total +1/+1 counters. At the start of Shawn's turn, he draws an additional card, then plays a mountain, and casts Greater Good, letting him sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to its power, then discard 3. After that, he casts Apex Altasaur, drawing a card, scrying 1, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, then fighting the Locust God. In response, Bilal casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards, putting 2 back on top of his library, making a Goblin, an Elemental, and 3 Insects. Then the Altasaur's ability resolves, fighting Locust God, then, thanks to its Enrage ability, also fighting Young Pyromancer and Krenko, killing all 3 creatures. Once that's resolved, Shawn sacrifices the Altasaur to Greater Good, drawing 11 cards and discarding 3. After that, he casts an Inscription of Abundance, gaining 12 life since he controls a creature with 12 power. Then at the end of turn, Locust God returns to Bilal's hand. When Bilal draws for turn, he draws an additional card, then plays an island and recasts the Locust God. After that, he also casts Impact Tremors, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control, making 2 more goblins with Elvika. This lets him equip the Skull Clamp to a goblin, killing it, drawing 2 cards, making 2 insects, and doing 2 damage to each opponent. He's able to repeat this process a total of 6 times, doing 12 damage to each opponent, knocking me out of the game. After that, he's able to attack Shawn for 28 total damage with all of his flying creatures, knocking him out as well and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a couple of mistakes made on my end. This is something that we talked about once the game wrapped up. But on the turn that I knocked Cow out of the game, if I had actually swung at Shawn, there's a good chance that I would have just been able to rebound and win the game entirely, especially because Cow had asked me ahead of time if I was going to use the All Will Be One to knock him out of the game, and I was kind of vague in my answer, so he blew it up. But there's a good chance that if I had said, yeah, I'm not going to attack you with it, or I'm not going to use that on you, used it to take out Shawn and Bilal, there is a chance I could have still won the game from there. So definitely some mistakes on my end, but overall, I think the deck performed very well. Being able to get a giant Thromok, like over 120 power, was super sweet. It was very impressive that Krenko stayed around as long as he did. I genuinely thought Krenko would die immediately because that's usually just what happens with Krenko. So very cool. I like the way the deck performed, but like I said, I definitely made a couple of mistakes. So definitely a thinking deck, and that is not my strong suit sometimes. Moving on, though, to Cow, I suppose. Cow really struggled this game. It looked like he was doing very well, which is why I chose to knock him out of the game originally, but he showed us once he had been knocked out that he had 7 lands in his hand, and almost all of his manifests and morphs were lands, so he really had just drawn nothing but lands the entire game, wasn't doing too much, but from an outside perspective, it definitely looked very scary. All of these face-down creatures that could be anything, knowing that they can flip face up and get some value. So definitely not the right call to knock him out when I did, but it made sense in the moment, maybe not so much looking back. Next up, Shawn's deck also did very well. I was impressed with the amount of fighting that he had in the deck, and the inclusion of Death Touch creatures was very, very smart because that allowed him to take down my Thromok, which was something that he would not have been able to do otherwise. So a very impressive showing from Nayeth, and every time we see Nayeth on this channel, it gets better and better. So I imagine next time it shows up, it'll be even stronger. And then finally, ending with Bilal. He didn't do too much in the early game and probably could have been knocked out early, but again, I focused my attention on Cow a little bit accidentally. But I think that once he got Ovika into play, it really started to take control of the game for him, and I was very, very impressed by Ovika. I didn't expect it to put in as much work as it did, but just being able to make, you know, a number of tokens equal to the mana value of a spell that you cast is very powerful. And the ward cost of 3 mana plus 3 life actually wound up mattering, because there were a lot of times that someone wanted to knock it out, maybe kill it with a fight effect or something, and we just couldn't do it because the 3 mana was just so prohibitive that it really stopped us from taking care of it, and Ovika took control of the game. And then once, of course, the Goblin Bombardment and the Locust God and Skull Clamp came down, it was over for us. So a very cool showing by Bilal. Veyron definitely put in a lot of work, even though Veyron wasn't in play most of the time. So very cool nonetheless. But let me know in the comments which deck you thought shone in the game, which one you thought put out the best effort, or maybe there's a deck that you want to see a little bit more of in the future. I would love to hear that, and I will of course pass that on to any of the deck's controllers. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed Deck Tech, hope you enjoyed the gameplay, and of course I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.